Welcome to a special bonus episode of Grounded with John Tester and Maritza Georgia. We have some headlines to go over, but let's explain where you are.
I am in the windy city of Chicago, heading to Maine, actually, to give a little speech at a college in Waterton, Maine. So it's good.
Uh, we wanted to bring you this to talk about some legislation coming up for a vote. But first, let's get to some headlines. I want to talk to you about tariffs. Senator President Trump took a pause on tariffs with more than 75 partners, but he raised the tariffs again for China, now at 125%. The stock markets surged almost immediately, but we have to mention that China and the EU imposed retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. This has been a roller coaster ride.
Yeah, it has been. And the uncertainty is bad for business. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. I'm glad the stock market bounced back today. It was a huge gain, largest since World War II. But I think the point is this. It's called thoughtfulness. And I don't have a problem with tariffs on China. That's part of the deal. They can open up their markets to American goods. But when you put tariffs on everybody in the world, then it's really hard to make tariffs work. And hopefully the president is taking a look at this and easing off some of the tariffs on our allies. On one hand, I think he did good work. On the other hand, quit fighting with our friends. Bring them along with us. You've always been the leader in the world, both from a democracy standpoint, military standpoint, and in this case, a trade standpoint. We need them. Bring them along. Put the pressure on China. Make them open up their markets so they're dealing in a fair way with trade. And it makes sense.
We have a lot of journalists excited about this news. A federal judge reinstated the Associated Press to White House event saying, turns out the government cannot bar journalists.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's exactly the way it should be. It's called freedom of the press. It's in our Constitution, and it's the way things should be. So I'm glad the court did the right thing this time.
Okay, Wednesday, a federal appeals court basically gave the Trump administration the okay to keep firing thousands of probationary government employees. This came after a Supreme Court decision earlier this week that overruled a different decision. It's a lot of ups and downs here, like we said, that blocked the firing of the same group. So this is exhausting. I can't imagine what this is like for these employees and their families. And it's important to point out, just because you're a probationary government employee doesn't necessarily mean you're new on the job. A lot of these folks were recently promoted.
That's right. And it also doesn't mean just because you're probationary, you're not doing a good job. And once again, not unlike the tariffs, this is about approaching this from a thoughtful standpoint. I'm going to say in the long run, I don't think it stays the taxpayer money. They just went in with a meat axe. They started hacking away, and I think that's a bad direction.
Okay, so the reason we are coming to you on a Wednesday evening is because there's this potential vote in the U.S. House Thursday regarding the SAVE Act. This has gotten a lot of attention on social media, and it kind of reignites this whole debate around voter access and election security, but it particularly has a lot of women paying attention. So we wanted to play for you this conversation we had just a couple of days ago, all about the SAVE Act and what it could mean for you. Greta Bedekovics is the Associate Director of Democracy Policy at American Progress. And before that, she worked on Capitol Hill as an advisor for Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. Here we go again, Senator. I'm going to talk about my love for Minnesota. Nice to see you, Greta.
Thanks so much for having me on today.
Good to have you on, for sure.
Okay, let's just start with an explainer here. Let's help us understand what the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility, or the SAVE Act, is, because we're seeing a lot of people talking about this. I'm seeing a lot of conflicting messages about what it will do, what it won't do. So if this passes, what will it look like for us in real life on the ground?
So yeah, the SAVE Act, like you called it, is a big misnomer because it would definitely not save any American citizens, but what it would do is block millions of eligible Americans from the ballot box. Because what it essentially says is that going forward, American citizens will be required to show proof of their citizenship, not just when they register to vote for the first time, but every single time they want to update their registration information. So anything like a move, or if you get married, those all count as updates. Under the bill, the vast majority of Americans would have to show either a passport or their birth certificate with government-issued photo ID. And so while they might sound easy to a lot of people, we've done data showing that 146 million American citizens, about half of American citizens, do not have a passport. If that number wasn't already staggering, we also know that 153 million people voted in the last presidential election cycle. So that's obviously a huge chunk of Americans. But 69 million married women who've taken their husband's name also don't have birth certificates that match, their current legal name, and would face huge obstacles under this bill. Another thing that we focused on is obviously the impact on rural voters, because some people think, like, even if I have my passport or my birth certificate, it's going to be easy for me. But you would still have to go in person under the bill to your election office. So there's rural Americans that would have to drive as much as 8 hours just to get to their election office. Some would even have to cross states. Someone would have to actually go through Montana to get back into Wyoming to register to vote. And so this, bill is not saving any Americans, but it would definitely disenfranchise millions of people.
So why is it put forth? I mean, what are they trying to accomplish with a bill that doesn't make a lot of sense, other than trying to keep people from voting? Is that really the agenda here? Because that's pretty anti-democratic.
I think it is definitely part of the agenda, but they also claim that it's to stop election fraud and that this is an election integrity bill. It's, the thing that they've been harping on for years is claiming that there are hundreds of thousands, if millions of non-citizens voting in U.S. elections. At the same time, they're unable to show any proof of that. And so I think in many ways, the SAVE Act started as kind of a messaging bill just to say, hey, we're going to require you as proof of citizenship. That's going to stop non-citizens from voting. But they haven't stopped to think how it's actually going to affect millions of eligible citizens from voting, and those are the people actually casting ballots.
What does the data say? How big of a problem is non-citizen voting?
The data shows that it's, so minuscule as to be like statistically, non-considerable. Even the Heritage Foundation, right, authors of Project 2025, years ago put out this massive report that was their kind of like election fraud report. And they were only able to find 41 instances of non-citizen voting in the 40 years of elections that they studied. And I checked. So there were 2.3 billion ballots cast in that amount of time, 40 years of federal elections by Americans. So that's like 0.7017 fraction of all ballots cast. So like it's zero. It's like the closest number you round it to. And again, that's from the Heritage Foundation, right? But also Representative Johnson, last presidential election cycle, said too that he wasn't able to find any evidence of non-citizen voting, that it was just something that was intuitive. And so they're willing to, continue pushing this bill that would cost American citizens their right to vote based on intuition.
So one of the things that when I was a U.S. Senator, we dealt a lot with was passports. They're not easy to get, and it's not like you apply one day and you get them even in a month. It's a month, half a year process, and that's not out of the ordinary at all. And with Musk cutting a lot of these agencies, who knows how long it's going to take now. But the question is okay, so my birth certificate says my name on it. My wife's birth certificate does not. So is this really an effort to keep women from voting?
They say it's not, because there's a provision in the bill that essentially directs states to figure out what to do in cases of name discrepancies. And so it's not an established process, right? So states can do this 50 different ways. And most would likely then have to pass laws saying that you can show a marriage license in collaboration, right, with your birth certificate in order to kind of like chronicle how you've changed your name to prove who you are. And so for somebody who's been married once, that could be fairly simple. You have your marriage license. For somebody who's been married multiple times, maybe as much as 3 times, that becomes incredibly difficult. And especially for a lot of elderly Americans whose marriage license was maybe issued, 50, 60 years ago, a lot of people don't have that on hand and may have lost it. And all of a sudden it's going to be key for them to register to vote, or even just truly just to update their registration if they move across town, if they move across the street, or if they move into like an elderly care facility, for example.
And all these things cost money, by the way. If you want to go get a copy of your marriage certificate, I think you got to go to the courthouse, but I'm not sure if it's the courthouse the county you were married in or the county you live in now. I think it's the county you're married in. I'm not.
And it's county we're married in. So probably people traveling back there, paying about $30 for a copy of this. And again, if you've been married multiple times, that's multiple journeys. And the first time passport cost is $165, not including expedited shipping if you need it.
Right, exactly. So this does become a dollar and cents item. And for a lot of folks that say, you know what, my vote doesn't count anyway, which, by the way, they all count. And they'll just say, the hell with it, we're not going to vote.
Exactly.
So, Greta, what kind of pushback are you seeing? Is this a party line support issue, or is there pushback from the Republican side here?
It's been fairly consistent along party lines. So the SAVE Act actually passed Congress during the 118th Congress, last Congress. It passed the House. It passed the House. And it was voted on by 5 Democrats as well. So generally party line, but we do see some dissension, I think, especially because it's really targeted as like a non-citizen voting bill that can be difficult to message around, obviously. But I don't think we've seen really Republicans peel off, even though I think in many ways to a lot of voters, the SAVE Act has become toxic because they associate it now with like preventing married women from voting. They've associated with preventing members of the military deployed overseas from registering to vote as well, having terrible impacts on rural voters, working class voters. And, there's members who've been confronted at town halls about this and basically asked to defend this in the public sphere, and they kind of couldn't and said that they would go back and read the bill and like look at it again. But we actually haven't seen Republicans, turn against it. Or even last week, they had chance in committee to make amendments to, for example, help married women at least symbolically, or help military and overseas voters at least symbolically by trying to make the bill better, and they, chose not to.
It's pretty crazy. I'm going to ask the question Maritza was going to ask, and that is, are there laws, other books to already prevent people from voting? I mean, do we need another tier of laws? Do we need another volume in our records, or is it already illegal to vote if you're not a citizen? And can this already be taken care of with the laws that are on the books?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's been federal law for decades now that non-citizens can only not vote in U.S. elections, but they can't even register to vote in U.S. elections. They can be sentenced to up to 5 years if that's something that they do. So it's a pretty strict law. But one of the things that Republicans and even President Trump executive order keep emphasizing is that they want, voter registration forms to ask if you're a U.S. citizen so that people have to attest to it. Well, the fact is that that's really the first question on any federal registration form is whether or not you are a U.S. citizen, and you're attesting to that under penalty of perjury. And election officials already use federal and state databases to verify eligibility. And some of the things that keep pointing to people as well is like, not only do we have federal law to protect, non-citizens from not voting, it's a crime, but it's also already federal law that Americans who register to vote have to provide identifying information. So for most voters, the top 2 requirement is that you have to put down your driver's license ID number on the application. And that's what helps election officials recognize who you are and then check your eligibility. And if you don't have that to make the process accessible, you can provide your social security information, usually the last 4 digits of your social security number. But so the idea is that we already have actually ID laws that most people want to see in place. They don't realize that they're there. And the requirements the SAVE Act would just go so far beyond that and block so many millions of people.
Greta, you brought up the executive order. So that was one of my next questions. How does that executive order compare or complement the SAVE Act? Is it nearly the same, or how does that fit?
It's similar in a lot of ways. I do think the best way to look at it is that it was, President Trump's, unconstitutional, essentially unilateral attempt to enact the SAVE Act. It does the same thing, when trying to require proof of citizenship on registration forms and things like that. But a key area of difference that I think should alarm a lot of people as well is that birth certificates are not even mentioned in the executive order affirmatively as like proof of citizenship. So it's really only a passport that Americans could actually use to prove their citizenship status that's valid under the executive order. So one, I think obviously that's a doubling down on, their attacks on birthright citizenship, essentially, by completely excluding that form of documentation that is generally still the most accessible to millions of Americans. But it's also the federal government, like we talked about earlier, that basically controls passport ownership. So now not only are they kind of saying in their minds that they think only people should passports should be able to vote, but that document is also one that they control, whereas, states issue birth certificates. So I think that's extremely concerning. And then because it's kind of an executive order, there's a bunch of other things thrown in there. One of the crazy things is that they basically want to empower Doge and Elon Musk to go through all state registration lists and basically review them. And basically, review who's registered to vote and maybe possibly who should not be registered to vote in their minds. And then there's just like election policies that Trump has clearly personally hated that he's also
Hold on though. Like, if this is an executive order he signed, does that mean this is where do we stand?
Yeah, I mean, there's already been, I think, at least 3 or 4 lawsuits. The chief thing that he basically does is, so there's the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which is based here in D.C. It's an independent agency, and he basically tasks this independent agency with rewriting the federal registration form that states abide by in order to require proof of citizenship on there. But because it's an independent agency, he doesn't have the authority to do this. And so that's kind of being unrolled right now. I mean, we've seen courts kind of take this up. But so that's a huge impediment there. And hopefully, the courts will hold up the way they're going to hold up. But that's sort of like step one that would need to happen, is that the EAC would actually have to change this sort of registration form. And then, all the executive agencies would have to basically start collaborating with states who are going to protect their data. One crazy quote that many people have been pulling out, but I think it was the Secretary of State of Mississippi who last Trump, presidential term, when they did the Kobach-Pence Commission to study voter fraud, basically told him to jump into the Gulf of Mexico if he wanted their data. So now I guess he could tell them to jump into the Gulf of America. But there's all these other crazy things in the EO that people aren't really focusing on. But the easiest way to look at it is basically the SAVE Act.
But it's being challenged.
It is being challenged, yes. And so a lot of secretaries of state have already come out to assure voters that, they can still register to vote, that this is not being enacted, that they're going to be, fighting it, and that they want to encourage people, obviously, to continue to register to vote and participate in elections, because it's not something that they want to, abide by unless, push comes to shove.
It's a crazy world we live in. When I first got involved in state politics, I was on the state administration committee in the state of Montana, and we worked in a bipartisan way. This was in 1999 to make voting more user-friendly so that you could go to the polls and vote without having to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. And it was a bipartisan effort to do that. And now it appears that, with a bill that I believe is being sponsored by Chip Roy in the House, they're doing everything they can do to make it so people not only make it hard to vote, but they can't vote. And it just really speaks to what I think is a dysfunction right now in American politics.
I think that's exactly right. And they're also just like setting up people to fail. Like, one of the key parts of the SAVE Act too, it says that people could use Real ID to prove their citizenship status as long as it shows that they are a citizen. But that's just not something the vast majority of Real IDs do. And so they even put this like nothing burger provision in there. And then Chip Roy stood up in front of the House Rules Committee and basically admitted this, saying that it's unworkable and that they're trying to like twist states' hands to redo Real ID if Americans want to use it. But they're legislating in a way that they know the policies aren't even workable, and they're not even trying to fix it, knowing that it's going to disenfranchise their own constituents, but Americans all across the country.
And we've seen this kind of just little chips away at making voting as easy as possible. And I remember the whole, I'm a Curb Your Enthusiasm Larry David fan, and they did a whole plot twist around this, but that you couldn't give voters standing in a hot line waiting to vote in Georgia a bottle of water. And yet we see that it's legal for Elon Musk to hand out $1 million checks to voters. How is that? How do people not see the difference there?
I feel like if we could answer that question, we'd be in a much better state for our democracy. But I mean, I completely agree. I think one thing I was looking at too, and coming to talk to you both, was even examples from Montana during COVID, in which, people on Blackfoot Reservation weren't able to get their ballots returned because, that's considered, if people who are paid to help them return those ballots, take money for their job, because it's literally their job, it's what they're getting paid for, then that's considered vote tampering to help somebody who's had heart surgery and is living on a reservation return their ballot. But yeah, Elon Musk can just write, now handfuls of people, $1 million checks to be, quote unquote, spokespeople for the campaign. And I mean, I think that level of corruption and inequality is obviously just growing, but I do think it's things like the SAVE Act make people realize that it's also just like indiscriminatory, right? Like, it's an attack on voting. It's not just an attack on Democratic voting. It's not even trying to promote Republican voting. It's just trying to stop voting, period.
Yep, 100%. And it really goes contrary to where we should be headed, and that is, just making sure the people who are voting are citizens. And we've done that pretty damn well in my entire lifetime, and at least in my perspective, it's certainly been done well.
Okay, Greta Bedekovics, the Associate Director of Democracy Policy at American Progress. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Reba. Have a great week.
Good to have you on. Thank you.
What do you make of all of that?
Well, I just think it's taking what I think is we'll just call it a lie, and trying to put policy around a lie, and that kind of policy is never good. It always impacts people who are honest, voting public. And it's going to keep them from voting. And I think it's just the wrong direction to be going. Like I said, when I was in the state legislature, we sat around, and some of the people on that state ad committee were very, very right wing, but we all had one thing in common, and that was we were going to try to make voting as user friendly as possible. Make sure the people who can vote could vote. And this goes just against that. This is making sure the people who can vote can't vote. And I think it's particularly discriminatory against women. And look, and just say, well, you just go down to the courthouse, get your birth certificate, get your marriage license, or whatever it might be. It's not as easy as that. And oftentimes when people go in to vote, they don't have that step right in hand by the time you get an election day's over.
Not to mention the financial part of this. I mean, I think that there is a level of privilege with a lot of people that they don't understand. There are many, many, many families in this country who don't have extra money for the gas it takes to drive to the election office, so the county seat, daycare, the time off work, all of that. And it's really prohibitive when you have to make multiple trips to your county courthouse to do something like this for a lot of people.
That's 100% correct. And it really does impact people who are out there too busy making a living to really worry about elections. And those are the folks that elections impact more than anybody else. We ought to be encouraging to go vote. We shouldn't be putting up roadblocks. And I didn't know much about this bill, quite frankly, but the more it's explained, the more it does is just put up more roadblocks so people can't get to the polls. And a select few end up voting for who's going to be our leaders in this country. And that's not how a democracy should be working.
Have you ever watched Curb Your Enthusiasm?
I don't get HBO, so no, I haven't watched it.
Gotta watch it on a plane. There's a whole season about Larry David giving a voter a bottle of water in Georgia, and he gets arrested.
Yeah, right. That's the way it should be, right? That's correct.
No water, no water. All right, let's see. You have a tan hat on with a denim blue brim, and there's an emblem, a patch. Let's see.
You get close-ups and
Great Falls International Airport.
absolutely. It's my airport of choice because it's the closest one to the farm, and I don't know why I'm wearing it today. I got no good excuse other than the fact that we appreciate affordable air travel, and hopefully we can continue getting more planes into Great Falls and more providers. I'm always when I was in the Senate anyway, giving guys hell for not having we got basically United and Delta and Alaska
Right.
and Great Falls, and we need a little Southwest and a little American action there too. That'd be great. So
Gotta come. Well, we don't have Southwest in Missoula, but we do have a few more options.
I got to tell you, I've flown them all, and they're all pretty damn good in my book. So we'll take more competition any way we can get it.
What kind of airport traveler are you? Are you like a last minute kind of guy? Or are you a stressor? Like you get there really early?
I get there plenty early.
Oh boy. You're the dad. You're the dad who gets there way too early and then you pace around.
No, I don't pace. I just sit there on my iPad and do some work or play games, one or the other. And my wife, who takes liquid prescriptions with her, she insists we get there ideally 2 hours early, even in a small airport like Great Falls, but at a minimum, a solid hour, usually an hour and a half, because she never knows. And by the way, she doesn't ever know if they let the stuff slide through or they're going to put up a fuss. And so
We used to have that problem with TV camera equipment also, and you don't know what's going to hold you up.
never know. And so rather than miss a flight, it doesn't hurt to be there a little earlier.
Well, I want to thank our guest, Greta Bedekovics. We want to thank our friends at Pro Jam for letting us use their music. You can find us on Substack, Blue Sky, Instagram, and YouTube. You can email us anytime at groundedpcast@gmail.com. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. We'll chat soon.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Tally ho.